to talk, we're going to talk about some things that are a little bit different, but they're certainly part of the whole package of tobacco issues. So I'm hoping today we have a lot of interesting people in the audience, so maybe we can get a banter going about some of these topics. What we want to talk about is alternative tobacco, which we sort of put in that parentheses of total tobacco products. And we need to treat it as tobacco, even though these are not necessarily our traditional combustible cigarette type products. But the quitting is the same, and issues may indeed be very similar to the regular tobacco cigarettes. We want to talk about harm versus health. Glenn is having problems with our computer. Hang on just a second. Okay, so we're first going to start in on e-cigarettes. And one of the things from last week that we talked about was how important comprehensive tobacco screening is. That if you ask a patient, do you use tobacco? Yes or no, they may say no, but they may be using these other alternative products like an e-cigarette. E-cigarettes are newer products to our country. They came in 2007. They were introduced to the world in 2004, but we received them in 2007. And in the 15 years that they have been here, they have done what I think we all would agree is an explosion. So we want to give them the important time that is due to this category. We talk about e-cigarettes, and what we're talking about is the electronic nicotine delivery system. What that system is that it's a variety of components. One is that there usually is a lithium-ion battery, and it is prone to some issues that we'll talk about. There's a heating coil or an atomizer as part of that system. There's a mouthpiece. There's a cartridge with nicotine, and that cartridge may not just contain nicotine. It may contain other chemicals, even cannabis and other illicit drugs. There are flavors in that cartridge, and we're going to talk about those. And there are some propellant chemicals like glycerin or propylene glycol that are used to aerosolize the mix. And it creates a particulate vapor for inhalation. And as you know, inhaling nicotine happens, the absorption happens remarkably quickly. When the alternative tobacco entered the market, it was not even at the time that tobacco cigarettes were categorized as a drug. So it wasn't until 2009 that the FDA began to regulate tobacco as a drug through the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. That's why many of us, those of us who are older adults, certainly have not had formal training in tobacco in our schooling. And it's very important as healthcare providers that we try to fill that gap by doing things like coming to our program today. By 2016, more than $2 billion was being spent on e-cigarettes that were not actually approved by the FDA. And in fact, e-cigarettes have yet to be FDA approved. And we'll talk through that today. Today, we are spending some $6 billion a year on e-cigarettes. In 2016, there was a final rule that applies to the Tobacco Control Act of 2009 that extended the FDA authority to additional tobacco products other than the usual tobacco cigarettes. this is a very complicated area, but it's sort of an underlying theme that Congress did not write as clearly as it might have when they wrote the bills. And the FDA has had to many times now go back and get rewording in order to make sure that there's a clarity of what they regulate and what they don't. So these nicotine sourced products from tobacco plants were added to the regulation in 2016. Since that time, there has become a new market for synthetic nicotine, not from tobacco plants. And again, the wording of the regulation had to be manipulated. And the FDA is chasing these new product entries all the time. And that's why we see big pharma goes back oftentimes, or big tobacco goes back oftentimes to sue for this and that statement. So it's very complicated. What we do know is that greater than 90% of adults start smoking prior to age 18. This is a disease, nicotine dependence is a disease of young people. And 2,500 youth start every day to use the nicotine type products. So with these ENDS products, the goal was to provide a lighter tobacco. And the theory was to create a safer cigarette, one that would be vaped. And then we see by 2017 that Juul brought out not just a cool new product, but a small product that's like a flash drive, easy to hide, flavored. It was a fun pod for kids, so you could get all kinds of flavors, the watermelon, etc. They spent a lot of money on giveaways to underage inductees and focused on a huge social media campaign. And as we now know, they have been pulled off the market. The flavorings are no longer allowed, except for menthol. And so there's a variety of issues that have come from this. And with Juul came an astronomical growth of e-cigarette use. So the regulatory piece that we need to keep a focus on is that with all of these products, the FDA is asking, when switching away from a traditional combustible cigarette, what is the evidence to support that users can switch without relapsing? So that is a very key component for FDA approval. And as I've said, these products still remain not FDA approved. There have been some that have been authorized, and we'll talk about that, but FDA approval has not yet occurred.
I want to just touch on the issue of creating a safer cigarette. The idea of a safer cigarette is based on the concept that with a combustible cigarette or traditional cigarette that's burned, the nicotine is not the substance that causes most of the health harms. It is all of the other substances that one inhales with a combustible cigarette. So the concept was that you could create a safer cigarette if the only product that you were inhaling was nicotine. We know that while nicotine is highly addictive, it's not terribly harmful as far as being a carcinogen, and its cardiovascular effects are real and acute as far as elevating blood pressure and
Increasing heart
rate, and probably some vasoconstriction as well.
Airway resistance.
But long-term, there's not a lot of good evidence that it triggers coronary artery disease, as cigarettes do. So the concept has always been, if you could just give people their nicotine by inhalation, you could have a safer cigarette. So the concept is that of harm reduction. The reality is that all of the things that are in e-cigarettes, the propellants, the flavorings, etc., lung toxic. And so while it is possible, although not proven, that vaping may be less carcinogenic than traditional combustible cigarettes, they are certainly not safe. So people use the term safer and harm reduction, but we don't really know how much safer or how much harm reduction we really are getting. Go ahead.
So here's a picture of a variety of these different products. The top disposable e-cigarette was the first generation, less power to it. It was a throwaway. Then we have some rechargeable strategies. We had a lot of people doing individual tank building, a lot of things so that they could maximize the heat and maximize the potency. As we heat nicotine to a higher degree, we get more effect, more significant risks. And it's very important that we keep up as healthcare providers with what is the product of the day. Juul is not shown here, the little flash drive like USB pods that are rechargeable and refillable. But now we're moving towards more disposable again because it is a loophole in some of the regulations. And we're seeing menthol being added instead of flavorings where they have been banned.
And I just want to take a second to talk about menthol. The reason that menthol is such a danger is that menthol is actually an anesthetic. So that when you inhale menthol, you don't get the burning that you might otherwise get from tobacco or from inhalation of smoke. And so it becomes much easier to take in the smoke when you have menthol. And so menthol smokers tend to take in more smoke because they breathe in more deeply, because it doesn't hurt when you use menthol. And that's the huge danger of menthol. It just makes an addictive substance even more addictive.
You want to talk about health?
Yeah, we said that there are a number of things that go into the e-cigarette liquid, and propellants are there to aerosolize the liquid, and they include things like glycerin or propylene glycol or diethylene glycol. And these are things that you may know of from antifreeze. When you inhale them, the body is not designed to exhale them.
And the heat increases their power and actually changes their chemical formulation. Glycerin with heat becomes acrolein, and propylene glycol with heat becomes formaldehyde.
And acrolein is thought to be the one of the most toxic substances in combustible tobacco. And so again, we talk about this harm reduction, but you are still getting this very toxic substance from the propellant.
And it has to have propellants in order to aerosolize and get into your lungs via inhalation.
Next thing I want to just touch on is flavorings. Flavor is something that you taste because it's something that you take in your mouth and ingest. But flavorings are approved by the FDA as generally recognized as safe if you're ingested in small amounts. So a flavoring that might be in a piece of candy that you chew, like vanilla cream, would be fine and is safe. What's never been studied is what happens when you aerosolize these things and you vaporize them. You heat them to high levels and then you inhale them. All of a sudden, they're not safe anymore. They've never been looked at. And there are some good examples of flavorings that when they are inhaled cause medical issues. A few years ago, there was an issue with microwave popcorn. The factory that made microwave popcorn, the employees were many of them were getting serious lung injury that was called popcorn lung. And that's because they were inhaling the diacetyl, this flavoring that gives popcorn its buttery flavor, is meant to be eaten but not inhaled. And when it's inhaled, it causes a lung disease, causes bronchiolitis obliterans. Vanilla cream can cause birth defects in zebrafish. I don't know if that's relevant to humans, and I don't know how zebrafish can possibly vape in water, but The point is, these substances can be toxic. And many of us are familiar with vaping injury that was seen with the vitamin E acetate as a cutting agent for inhalation, particularly with THC compounds, that was called EVALI, which was electronic vaping lung injury.
Acute lung injury.
And
EVALI.
and it was relatively common, and it really has not gone away. More common with the THC inhalation, but it has been seen with other inhalations as well, other types of vaping.
So heating nicotine, the high temperature, it creates toxic opportunities. There's heavy metal seepage from those reused batteries. A lot of people make their own. There are suggestions that current products that are on the market are seeping. There may be lead or silver, tin, arsenic, cadmium, lithium, you name it. So that's another opportunity for problems. As we mentioned, the higher the heat, the more potent, the more ability of that nicotine to get where it needs to go and be very powerful. It creates these formaldehyde releasing agents in the lungs by these various chemicals we've discussed. And the nicotine content can then go even higher than tobacco cigarettes, which is a very important point to keep in mind, that even with e-cigarettes and everybody goes, oh, it's less nicotine, so maybe it's better. You know, as you go higher with the heat, and these newer generations of products allow for that, then nicotine becomes much more readily bioavailable. So the third-hand particulate matter is important as well to the environment, to those other people in the family or at school or wherever it is that e-cigarettes are being used. Third-hand particulate matter is not just in the air, it's what falls onto the table surface or the chair. It's touched by your hands. You then put it into your eye when you're rubbing your eye. Kids get it, pets get it, and it has toxicity associated with it. As we mentioned, increased diastolic, blood pressure, heart rate, and airway resistance, just with one cigarette.
So this has really become a huge issue for youth using e-cigarettes and vaping. A third of the teens who try e-cigarettes end up being dual users. So they also start smoking combustible tobacco within 1 year. And these are particularly difficult patients to manage, to get them off the combination of vaping and combustible cigarettes.
Much more nicotine dependence. If they're moving to the next product, it's usually because they are nicotine dependent and they need more nicotine. As you know, the first time you smoke or you vape, it's a really fun experience. Everybody loves it. The fourth or fifth or sixth time, they feel the nicotine need.
And again, there are a bunch of synthetic products. You can give nicotine in gum and gummy bears, lots of flavorings.
And the manufacturers actually created new products of synthetic nicotine gum in pouches to get the kids hooked. So that's a very significant point. A lot of the backstory that we don't hear about. So nicotine in e-liquids, we've talked about it being higher concentration than in other nicotine containing products, even though we think it's less. So the average e-cigarette has 3 to 5 milligrams of nicotine, and the average tobacco cigarette should have 10 to 14 milligrams of nicotine. But again, it's the bioavailability of this and the power of the heat that can make it very significantly comparable. So it's how you manipulate that cartridge. And the aerosol is a suspension in gas. So that's what people are exposing their lungs to. Here are a couple of references for resources, and I know we have a pediatrician and some nurse practitioners in the audience. This would be some good places for you to find resources about talking with teens. As we know, with the kids in particular. It may even be that their parents are users, and so they think it's cool to use too. You know, it's sometimes as simple as that. You may have to work with the parents, getting the parents to successfully quit, to move the kids forward on this. So since in the last decade, the rate of use of e-cigarettes among middle and high schoolers has more than tripled. So the manipulation around tobacco 21 laws is very significant. And what that means is that the tobacco 21 laws that we thought were going to really help all the communities to not allow young people to purchase have really, unfortunately, met themselves with a wall because of the internet. So they can only do so much in the live retail establishments. And kids have gone to the internet and they're mailing now products to young people. And it's very significant to assume that this will continue, that people are figuring out loopholes all the time. And it is a $6 billion, maybe this year in 23, it may be as much as 8 billion.
So we want to talk a little bit about thinking about e-cigarettes as harm reduction tools for current smokers to quit, because this is the argument that the manufacturers of e-cigarettes make. And they say, oh, this is a tool for getting smokers to quit smoking. It's harm reduction. E-cigarettes are safer than combustible cigarettes. And it's important that we look at some of the evidence for this. And the first bit of evidence that I want to raise is that there is no evidence that e-cigarettes are safer than combustible cigarettes. That has been an assumption that we have had since these were developed, again, because there are fewer chemicals, there are fewer products in an e-cigarette as opposed to a combustible tobacco, but we still have no good evidence to say that vaping is safer. It's just been an assumption that we have made, not based on good data. There's actually a paper that came out just within the last week that shows that changes within the cells in the buccal mucosa occur the same with combustible cigarettes and with vaping. So there is still significant risk. The second part about whether these e-cigarettes are useful as a tool to get people to quit smoking, there are a handful of studies that have been done. Probably the most prominent study is a study out of the United Kingdom that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in February of 2019. That was a randomized trial of e-cigarettes versus nicotine replacement therapy. And the quick bottom line was that 1 year abstinence rates were 18% with e-cigarettes and 10% with nicotine replacement. So the short headline is e-cigarettes, you're twice as likely to quit smoking as if you use nicotine replacement. What they didn't talk about, and what you actually have to read the paper to find out, is that at 1 year, 80% of the people using e-cigarettes were continuing to smoke using e-cigarettes. So they were vaping, they weren't using combustible cigarettes, but they were 80% continued to use e-cigarettes, whereas only 9% of the people in the nicotine replacement group were continuing to use nicotine replacement at 1 year. So the one study that was done, and it was done with first generation e-cigarettes in England.
Low heat, low nicotine amounts,
So-
1 to 3% of nicotine.
So a different product than you could ever get in the United States today. People did not give up using their e-cigarettes, so they made a switch, but they did not stop their nicotine dependence. whereas the people who used nicotine replacement therapy had a much higher rate of not needing nicotine replacement. The bottom line of what the role for these products, for e-cigarettes, for getting people to stop using combustible tobacco, I'm going to quote directly from the New England Journal. We recommend that e-cigarettes be used only when FDA-approved treatments combined with behavioral counseling fail, that patients be advised to use the lowest dose needed to manage their cravings, and that there be a clear timeline and off-ramp for use. So again, these are not recommended, but if someone has failed everything else and this is the next option, we need to use the lowest possible doses of nicotine, and we need to put a timeline for when people are going to stop using their e-cigarettes.
So we as clinicians need to learn the slang terms. Again, with tobacco screening, if you're asking the yes, no question, you're not going to get a lot of information. That's why we talked about the comprehensive approach last week of trying to get extracting information. And you will need to be able to recognize the jargon, the techno fogger that the person might be using, or the e-juice. You never know what they might say, and trying to identify that. And that may not be tobacco to them. So they may not even consider that in the category that we're talking about today. And as we mentioned, right now, people are going more to menthol, e-cigarettes, and disposable again because of the loopholes in the law and the new products coming out. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Here's a case that I think will just give us a little flavor of what we might see in a patient. A Hispanic female started using at 16. She self-reported addiction then as she looks back. I mean, she knew she was addicted very quickly. She said there was always a gas station or an older friend or a website. And she really loved the banana ice cream and the sour apple flavors. In a couple of years, by the time she was 19, she was vaping THC in a device that was advertised to hold tobacco-free nicotine. So she was able to add the THC and make it an individualized approach. And she inhaled as much as 2 packs of tobacco cigarettes every couple of days. So what that means is that she is e-vaping a lot. And as the higher heat occurs, we get more bioavailability. She began to fall ill with what she thought was a bad cold, rapid breathing. This was before COVID, so it wasn't COVID. Almost gray lips. She felt depleted and she went to the emergency department. Her oxygen saturation was 67%, and she got to go to the ICU, and she was diagnosed with the vaping-related lung injury, EVALI. She's now down to 2 cigarettes a day and a taper down. She's been struggling with a full quit. So the taper for her is helping. We need to remember that even when people are taking a lower nicotine or a lesser amount of cigarettes per day, they are still at risk of the many damaging effects of tobacco. But she is much better off than she was before. So she is trying to motivate other people to do their quits, and she's trying to be supportive of them because she's been through so much. We want to move to hookah now. You want to do that?
Well, let's talk a little bit about hookah. I don't know about in Northeast Ohio, but certainly in Southwest Ohio, there are hookah lounges, and they particularly occur in areas near college campuses. And somewhere around 15% of college students have used hookah. It's considered a very social opportunity for people, as opposed to cigarette smoking.
it's perceived as not harmful. It's sort of cool, and there's music in a lot of these hookah bars. There's a lot of fun going on. It's a real social scene.
People use lots of puffing, 100 to 200 puffs. People share the mouthpiece amongst friends, which means that there's always the risk of contagious diseases from sharing the mouthpiece. And the amount of nicotine that people take in is tremendously higher than somebody who smokes a typical cigarette. It's like smoking 1 to 2 packs of cigarettes.
Just as an aside, it's really important for us as healthcare providers to understand also that hookah is oftentimes exempted from smoke-free laws. The reason for that is that hookah lounge owners are oftentimes local, supported retail establishments that are trying to succeed. And so they are able oftentimes to get exemptions from the smoke-free status. And this is a very scary situation because certainly this is not without its own harms. So what is hookah? It's a flavored tobacco mixture. Oftentimes it's got molasses in it. It's passed over a charcoal heated area in the pipe and then through a water-filled chamber. And in spite of all those cool things, the toxicities don't reduce when the water-filled chamber is involved or the heated charcoal is involved. In fact, the tar and the heavy metal toxicity, it is alive and well. The user inhales through a tube, and the mouthpiece is usually shared, as we have already spoken about.
So this is just one example of what a hookah looks like. And what you can see is that you've got the head, which is where the charcoal is going to heat up the tobacco and molasses mixture. The smoke goes through the water bowl and then back out through the mouthpiece, which is then shared amongst a number of different participants who are using hookah as a social event.
A lot of times I'll talk with parents of high schoolers and they say, you know, my kids, they're great. They're not doing anything. They come home at 11 o'clock. What mom doesn't know is that from 9:30 until 10:30, they're at the hookah lounge. And that's really, sadly, the truth these days. So here are some other products that I think are important for us to just put in that category that people can surprise you all the time with what they are able to find online or elsewhere. They may bring it in from outside of the country. Cigars, it is the buccal absorption that is significant, and it often is equal to tobacco cigarettes or greater than the absorption of tobacco cigarettes. Pipes, we've been very well aware for years the flavored tobacco was so appealing. Cretic is a clove flavored with eugenol, which is an anesthetic-like product that allows us, when we use Cretic, to really get that deep lung heated feeling that gives us 20 times the risk of lung injury. These other products you may see on the street, you may be surprised that people are doing these things, but they certainly are quite popular in various social settings and in people who sometimes are without permanent housing. Access to the internet and the charge card for the young people, the sky's the limit, as you know. So we just have to be ready for what's going to come through the door the next time. I want to talk a little bit about snus, which is a smokeless tobacco product that is actually banned in the European Union. It is a lower nicotine, very cute looking, sort of in a tea pouch kind of product with very small pieces of tobacco that are oftentimes flavored in lovely ways. Sweden originated this product, and it has now received a modified risk status from the FDA because it has been shown to be less harmful than the traditional tobacco cigarettes. So with the FDA, we're talking about a pre-marketing tobacco authorization that they are going through right now with all of these products, and it has received approval, one of very few products that have received authorization. I used approval in the wrong way there. It has not received FDA approval. It has received this pre-marketing authorization. So no FDA approved marketed product exists. The FDA is still in the process, as you know, of fighting the battle and evaluating all of these products. They have not yet approved any e-cigarette or smokeless new product at all. So we're waiting for that information, and it will be soon that we will hear some of that. In Sweden, tobacco cigarettes are used by about 5% of the population of the adults, and smokeless is used by 20%, 1 out of 5 people. With snus, you place it behind the upper lip and enjoy the opportunity for it to be absorbed in that area.
So, you know, we typically think in this country about smokeless tobacco, and this is a form of smokeless tobacco, except that it's, instead of the actual tobacco, it's in a little sachet, so it's
Easy to use.
easy to use. You don't have to spit out the juice on a regular basis. So it's cleaner, it's nicer to use, but it is still smokeless tobacco and you still have significant risks. So the goal of our talking today, and the goal of last week and of next week, is really to encourage everybody to become an advocate for getting people into evidence-based tobacco treatment. So last week we talked about how to screen people. Today we focused on alternative sources of tobacco, of nicotine, such as e-cigarettes, hookah, snus. And our goal is that as you become educated in these things, and next week we'll talk about the techniques that are for evidence-based tobacco treatment. Our goal is to get everybody to be an advocate, to get everybody up front, to really help them get their patients to quit using tobacco.
I'm sure there are lots of questions. I hope there are. Please.